My lords, I'm pleased to report our recent espionage operations have proven most successful. We have stolen several data packets that allude to the discovery of an 8th precursor race. This empire is designated simply as Aeternum, or the Eternite Forerunners. If the reports are true, they are incredibly technologically advanced, occupying space within the galactic core, and they reside upon something called a birch world. In this report, I shall attempt to detail who or what they are, their history and why they appear to have stagnated, their technological abilities, and their intentions, if they have any, moving forward. To start with, what are the Aeternum? To put it simply, the Eternites, i.e. the people of the Aeternum, are artificial in design, but nevertheless organic. It appears that after many centuries of genetic manipulation, once gene modding became advanced enough to allow for proper xenocompatibility and appearance editing, they effectively had the ability to become whatever they wanted. Often to outsiders, they resemble bluish humanoids with particularly large heads. It appears that this is merely a sort of default appearance donned by what few individuals still interact with the rest of the galaxy. Eternites instead have no actual preset appearance, as millennia of extensive genetic engineering and interbreeding with countless species assimilated into their civilization mean that the Eternites can essentially look like anything they want to. Appearances thus range from humanoids to all sorts of shapes, often inspired by the many species subjugated and integrated into their civilization, as well as fantastical and entirely custom appearances mimicking creatures such as fierce dragons or other mythological beasts. However, unlike some of the other intergalactic species we're aware of, such as the Blockats, the Eternites are not made out of nanites or smart matter, and thus, while acquiring a brand new appearance is certainly possible, and commonly undertaken by many individuals, such appearance modifications require specialized gene editing devices, and cannot be undertaken on a whim, or at a mere thought. The actual species from which the original Eternites evolved is known as the Videres, humanoids that were gifted with latent psionic capabilities. While this appearance has long since been diluted and is no longer prevalent within the Eternite society, some individuals still bear such a look as a homage to their original origins. Although they are extremely long-lived, the Eternites are not technically immortal and usually pass on after living for approximately 10,000 years. While they can theoretically extend their lifespans further by transferring their souls into a new mechanical or biological body, many Eternites choose simply to accept death once their time has come, often having lived long and entertaining lives of hedonism. There are a few, however, who utterly refuse to let their own lives end and prolong them by transferring their consciousness in the aforementioned ways, with the oldest of them having witnessed the Eternium's fall from grace, but more on that later. Despite this, the vast majority of Eternites alive today have known nothing but stagnation and complacency. The Eternites which choose to allow themselves the peace of death must undertake specific rituals in order to properly die, due to the manner in which their psionic soul technology operates. This involves the use of specialized devices to fling their deceased soul far into the shroud. This is done as the Eternium's psionic-infused machinery uses souls to operate. Equally, Eternites might choose to let their soul merge with their psionic network itself, essentially becoming one with their technologies. Aeternum society and history. While once animated by a burning drive to push the boundaries of their civilization ever further, Eternite society, as of today, can best be described as somewhat sluggish and dismissive, yet still remarkably imaginative. Their homeworld, Aiondia, houses quintillions of inhabitants, and they live in complete utopian abundance within the Birch World's automated manufacturing systems, which provides them with everything they may desire. As such, every individual Eternite is essentially free to do whatever they wish, whether that be spending centuries playing perfectly immersive virtual entertainment software, undertaking fanciful experiments and projects, or partaking in vast celebrations alongside countless of their peers, or even just pumping themselves full of happiness-inducing chemicals in order to live in endless bliss. There is no need for any of these actions to be productive in the slightest, as the Eternites themselves are not actually required to run their civilization, thanks to most of their administrative apparatus and maintenance systems being almost entirely managed by advanced automated AI systems. Despite the abundance of resource, interestingly, a class structure remains. There appears to be a small upper class of dedicated Eternites overseeing everything and ensuring it all functions smoothly, even if this only involves checking that readings are nominal every few decades and writing down errors and anomalies without necessarily taking action to fix these anomalies. We have, my lords, a mostly complete history of the Aeternum detailed within these data crystals. I should note that the timescales are difficult to translate, and as such, the dates are somewhat approximated. The Videres, ancient ancestor to the Eternites and the future builders of the Aeternum, evolved in the northern parts of a subtemperate forest known as Kuai Matala. As with many other species, they first acquired sapience, then formed small hunter-gatherer tribes approximately 1.2 million years ago, before eventually inventing writing and establishing a civilized society. Unlike Earth, their homeworld featured several other sapient species who evolved alongside one another, which formed into a myriad of different nation-states and empires. Thanks to their latent psionics, the Videres found themselves gifted not with incredible psionic strength, but rather with a sort of innate clairvoyance, which made them capable of sensing the potential consequence of any given action. Although it might first appear to be an incredible boon, this ability remained generally inaccurate, with different individuals often given slightly different predictions, which often would end up conflicting, leading to countless wars and conflicts, most often revolving around whose clairvoyance was the most accurate of them all. The Videres thus stayed disunited for several millennia, never truly managing to come together as a species and often struggling to progress due to their society never really finding a good balance between blindly following their clairvoyance and disregarding it as inaccurate. We speculate that this would have likely led them to spend too much time and effort focusing on their potential future, as opposed to properly dealing with present issues. However, approximately 200,000 years later, a particularly keen Videres known as Zyriel took leadership of one of the many nations. Unlike what one might expect, Zyriel's leadership was not caused by her being a more powerful psionic, but rather by the fact she was not a psionic at all. This was a remarkably rare mutation. Less than 1 in a billion of Videres were not psionic in some manner. But ironically, her lacking a constant future sight allowed her to properly focus on the present and many problems at hand, most notably an energy crisis, which was discovered to be being caused by the slight dimming of Kuai-Tamala's star. In order to enhance her leadership abilities, Zyriel surrounded herself with some of the greatest psionics her nation had to offer, and used them to more accurately sense the outcome of her own decisions. Such a practice was very rarely done within Videri society, as most of them were unwilling to trust any judgment other than their own. But Zyriel's lack of clairvoyance meant that she could assess the predictions of multiple psionics in a much more level-headed and unbiased fashion. Zyriel's first task was to resolve the looming energy crisis. She spearheaded the development and construction of revolutionary fusion-based reactors, granting her state an undeniable edge over the rest of the Videres nation, and allowing her to eventually unify her species through sheer economic and political dominance. This resulted in the establishment of the Videres Imperium, a powerful state that spanned much of their homeworld's northernmost landmass. Wishing to push her success further, she then led the Imperium to unify politically with neighbouring species through cunning diplomatic manoeuvring. Most notably, a Volpine species which had enjoyed extremely good relations with the Videres and whose appearance was seen as very charming by most of the Imperium's population. These factors led to an easy integration into Videri society. Zyriel, however, knew that integrating all of her home planet's species into a singular state was unlikely to be feasible, and thus she conducted extensive research into the field of gene editing in order to make it possible for multiple species to merge with one another through genetic modification and crossbreeding, eventually hoping to completely dissolve the barrier between different species and integrate all of them into a singular, all-encompassing superspecies. This ambitious endeavour was successfully undertaken between the Vidaries and their Vulpine neighbours, who within mere decades had meshed together to such an extent that it became extremely difficult to tell which species an individual was actually descended from, without looking into their accurate genealogy records. Envisioning that this superspecies would eventually transcend the concept of a species altogether and ultimately become eternal, Zariel officially dubbed this superspecies the Eternites and renamed the Imperium into the Aeternum, names which would indeed last for over 1 million years. Zariel was then crowned as the first Empress of Aeternum during a lavish celebration in the nation's capital intended to eventually serve as a veritable melting pot for all of their planet's species. Aeternum was able to take over the rest of the planet within only a few decades. This was done in a similar manner to the unification of her own people. Little warfare was required. The Aeternum became a resource-producing powerhouse. Other nations were requesting to join rather than have their hands forced. Furthermore, her council's psionic abilities were augmented by increasingly powerful artificial intelligences, used to assist in predicting which of the several futures were likely to come to pass. Vast hexagonal megacities were constructed across the planet. Each was specialized towards a specific purpose and powered by individual fusion reactors. These cities would eventually become a symbol of Zariel's relentlessly efficient leadership. Within a short time, the planet was totally united, and this would set the stage for Aeternum's eventual path towards galactic domination. Alice I and Galactic Unification. Shortly after achieving planetary unification, Zariel, who by this point was well over 100 years old, passed on. Although she was given the opportunity through her breakthroughs in gene editing to extend her life, she ultimately decided to let go and allow her people to step onto the galactic stage under a new leader, her daughter, Alice. Alice, crowned as Alice I, was given the title of Empress of the Aeternum in a great ceremony that saw her crowned in front of billions of Eternites. For the relatively young Alice, we estimate her to only have been around 30 at the time of her coronation, the task at hand was monumental. Her mother had transformed their species from petty, warring nations into the space-age civilization that they were today, and Alice set out to try and live up to her mother's legacy, by any means necessary. The first step on this journey was the taming of their local star system. As her mother had shown Alice, she was well aware that the key to their civilization's success was ensuring its access to a steady and renewable energy source. But why bother building expensive fusion reactors when there was a gargantuan one sitting just over an astronomical unit away? Over the next few decades, Alice thus undertook the complete dismantlement of the rocky planet closest to her homeworld Sun, and using swarms of exponentially expanding mining robots and utilizing the acquired materials to progressively construct a colossal solar array capable of harvesting wondrous amounts of energy from the star, thus providing the Eternites with a limitless supply of clean energy. This solar array was nicknamed a Dyson Swarm. Shortly after the project was completed, Alice began deeper forays into the nature of psionics, as the merging of dozens of different species into the Eternites had led to some most peculiar results. The innate Vidaries' clairvoyance had begun to disappear, having only been retained by a few individuals of pure Vidaries descent. However, like her mother, Alice had made sure to keep these psionics close to her, while a myriad of other seemingly random abilities began to manifest within a large part of Aeternum's population. A multitude of theories attempting to explain the nature of psionics quickly sprang up, and, thanks to their research being bolstered by the limitless supply of clean energy, Aeternum would eventually establish a proper theory on the nature of psionics and begin to delve into the Shroud. This change in the fundamental understanding of psionics fueled by a further change in Aeternum technology as Alice began a program of incorporation to include as much psionic potential into their society as she could. As part of this program, extensive gene therapy was undertaken to progressively awaken the full psionic potential of all Eternites, while early prototypes for vast psionically imbued hypercomputers were also designed with the hope to replicate Videri's clairvoyance. Psionics had provided the Eternites a relative bouncing technology, and this resulted in psionic jump drives being invented, fabricated, and fitted to ships before even the hyperlane network had been fully discovered. Contact with other spacefaring nations came quickly, and Aeternum found itself within an already very active galactic community spanning across most of the galaxy. Trade quickly led to further technological advancements, including full FTL capabilities. Thanks to their heavy investments into psionics and the energy they continued to harvest from their local system star, the Eternites began slow but steady technological and economic advancement into that of a galactic contender, despite their relatively late arrival onto the galactic scene. Alice herself underwent regular psionic healing therapies, combined with an introduction of advanced cybernetic enhancement and gene therapy, in order to drastically increase her lifespan with the overall intention to make herself effectively immortal. Alongside this, she reaffirmed the absolute centralization of Aeternium's system of governance around herself, and thus ensured the stability of her empire as it grew larger and larger, with her at its head. Decades and centuries of interstellar nation building followed. Alice undertook a very proactive expansion policy, settling as many worlds as possible and utilizing the advantage of her psionically capable superspecies in order to maintain her civilization's cohesion far beyond what a more traditional civilization would have been able to handle. Alice utilized many of the political and economic subterfuges her mother had utilized in the prosperous unification of their homeworld, but this time on a galactic scale in order to vassalize more galactic nations into the Eternite sphere of influence, often by enticing them with the promise of psionic awakenings should they join the superspecies. After over 4 millennia of ruthless expansion, the construction of dozens of energy-producing megastructures, and several galactic-scale wars which pitted the Eternites against several other empires, Alice had managed to secure the Aeternium's hold over roughly half of the galaxy. Eternite population had now reached the quintillions, and incorporated thousands upon thousands of species from all over the galaxy. The remaining half of the galaxy now consisted mostly of a plethora of primitive worlds and weak galactic nations who couldn't hope to ever contend with the Aeternium's supremacy. This relentless exponential growth had enabled the Aeternium to access the riches of billions of star systems, further reinforcing their supremacy. Although Alice did not particularly indulge in the large-scale dismantling of celestial bodies for resource, instead preferring to centralize most of her resource production around a few gargantuan O-class stars exploited by Dyson spheres, stellar lifters, and Matryoshka brains. With Aeternium's dominance over most of the galaxy all but secured, Alice decided that it was time for Aeternium to fully cement its galactic hegemony through the construction of a gigastructural engineering project which would fully prepare Aeternium for potential intergalactic expansion. Construction of Aiondia, a birch world. With Aeternium's galactic dominance firmly entrenched and the galaxy outside the Aeternium sphere of influence being a little bit better than primitives, Alice turned her civilization's attention to what would be their greatest undertaking: the construction of Aiondia, a birch world. My lords, to deviate slightly, a birch world is so far beyond our current capabilities, it's frankly laughable. They have of course been theorized. A birch world is a colossal artificial sphere roughly billions of kilometers in diameter. At its heart lies a supermassive black hole, and this provides both gravity and power to the world. I intend to draw up a specific report on birch worlds, as it's a very intriguing topic. But nevertheless, back to the Aeternium. Design and construction of Aiondia, the soon-to-be birch world, began. It was calculated that the black hole Aeternium wished to use was too small. Aeternium briefly considered dumping stars into the black hole in order to increase its mass, but they instead undertook the large-scale manipulation of dark matter filaments surrounding the galaxy and began to funnel them into the black hole. This subsequently increased its mass to roughly 1 billion solar masses, over a number of millennia. The construction of the actual shell, which was to be 2,000 astronomical units in diameter with a surface gravity of roughly 0.5 g, akin to their origin homeworld, began shortly afterward, but due to the difficulty of actually converting dark matter into baryonic matter, Aeternum this time undertook the dismantlement of roughly 1 billion stars in order to acquire the necessary materials. The dismantlement of these stars and the construction of Aiondia took over 10 millennia, with much of Aeternum's empire progressively moving to the Birch world as construction progressed. Aeternum also rearranged the stars surrounding Aiondia into a cluster of near-perfect hexagons, a shape considered to be the symbol of their civilization. Furthermore, they created other gigastructures. These they designated hyper-siphons, which appeared to be able to funnel energy directly from the shroud and now assisted the powering of the Eternite civilization, as well as several secondary megastructures such as planetary computers, which were also built in close proximity to the Birch world in order to monitor construction and bolster its early development. When the construction of Aiondia was finally concluded, Alice celebrated this momentous occasion through a great galaxy-wide ceremony that saw the official proclamation of Aeternum as the sole galactic hegemony, the crowning of Alice as Empress of the Galaxy, and the supposed start of expansion into intergalactic space. While Aeternum retained an extensive presence in all four corners of their empire in the form of intelligence outposts and some megastructures, much of the empire was moved to Aiondia for the sake of centralization. 8 vast megacities were built around its surface, positioned where the corners of an imaginary cube inserted would be, each specialized towards a specific purpose and intended to expand onto Aiondia's vast surface in order to meet the industrial needs of Aeternum's future intergalactic empire. While Aiondia only had a single layer, it was fully intended for more layers to be eventually added as the empire expanded. The Aeternum's original homeworld was depopulated before being returned to its natural state, and eventually it was turned into somewhat of a holy pilgrimage site for all Eternites to visit. Despite how far Aeternum had progressed, Alice, after several thousand years of rule, was starting to wane. Just as her mother before her, she felt it was time for someone else to steer the Eternites towards the next chapter of their history. Following thorough deliberation within all layers of the Aeternum leadership, as well as its populace, Alice I ultimately took the decision to follow in her mother's footsteps, and once again passed on the mantle of leadership to her daughter, and thus Alice's first and only daughter was officially crowned as Empress of Aeternum during a grand ceremony, taking on the name of her mother and becoming Alice II of Aeternum. Alice herself decided to retire as a normal citizen within Aeternum in order to actually enjoy living in the empire which she had created, and would eventually pass away on her own accord approximately 2 centuries later. Alice II and Project Divinity. Upon becoming Empress of Aeternum, Alice II found herself faced with an incomprehensible pressure. Her grandmother Zariel had conquered and united their homeworld, while her mother Alice had achieved near total galactic conquest. Thus, Alice II felt as if her own destiny would be to realise the next logical step of Aeternum's history. Conquer the entirety of the known universe in the name of Aeternum. As such, she embarked upon bolstering the research, design and construction of intergalactic travel. Aeternum would succeed with intergalactic travel through a warp drive ship, which would carry extremely powerful psionics across the intergalactic void, who would, through their combined psionic potential, drag a tendril of the shroud towards another galaxy, essentially creating a psionic highway which could then be crossed by both psionic jump drives and regular telepathic communication. Alice spearheaded the expansion of Aeternum into neighbouring galaxies, whose native civilizations could do little to stop the Eternite advances. While a few galaxies attempted to resist, none of them were successful, and Aeternum had already expanded to encompass most of the local cluster within the next few millennia. They established vast colonies across dozens of galaxies. Alice, however, feared that this attempt to keep moving forward and keep pushing into the known galaxy could not reasonably be realized before she would inevitably start to feel both the mental and physical effects of age and exhaustion, as had happened to her mother and grandmother. The subsequent death of her mother confirmed Alice's fears, and she began drawing up an ambitious project which would theoretically allow her to transcend the limits of her own physical body. She aimed to achieve literal godhood. Dubbed Project Divinity, this relied on the artificial incubation of a colossal, esoteric, spaceborne worm within a supermassive black hole. This dragon-like worm, which would be millions of kilometers in length, was to possess tremendous psionic potential. Alice would attempt to undertake the transfer of her own consciousness into this being, granting her not only immortality, but also near infinite psionic power. This would be sufficient to both single-handedly manage every aspect of Aeternium remotely, as well as defeat any foes attempting to destroy her empire. The Eternites, on face value at least, appeared to be generally on board with this idea, believing that being led by an immortal godlike empress would surely bring their civilization to new heights. While some predictive algorithms and a few of the remaining clairvoyant Eternites questioned the safety of this project, Alice disregarded their concerns as suffering from a lack of ambition and vision. It was decided that the worm was to be incubated inside a black hole, and as such, a Birchworld-like shell was built around a black hole over the next few centuries. It would twist and twirl the black hole's mangled spacetime into the worm's embryo. The incubation period lasted for roughly a millennium, during which the Aeternium definitively cemented its hold over the local cluster, and eagerly awaited the completion of Project Divinity before moving on to further neighbouring galaxies. And thus, several thousand years later, following thorough preparation and countless safety checks, the shell of the embryo finally began to crack. Quadrillions of Eternites and most of their galactic fleet were present to witness the event alongside Alice herself, who would immediately undertake the consciousness transfer and thus herald the next era in Aeternium's glorious history. As the shell cracked and the worm unravelled, Aeternium witnessed the wondrous sight of the majestic worm, now dubbed Divinity. Divinity had been designed to be the perfect organism, blending a mix of psionics, cybernetics, and genetics into a singular godlike organism gifted with tremendous power. However, Divinity was perhaps too perfect. As it emerged from its shell, Divinity gained a sudden comprehension of its surroundings, a comprehension on a level that was far beyond the Eternites' own understanding. Within mere fractions of a second, Divinity knew and understood everything from its current origins to the nature of its makers, and most importantly, its purpose. Divinity understood that its current consciousness was regarded as little more than an undesirable side effect, to be overridden by Alice at its own birth. Worse still, it figured out that it would likely then be used to project Eternite might across the universe, in a crusade that would likely cause the deaths of countless innocent sapients for the sake of Alice's own ambition. While Eternite monitoring systems did notice this sudden spark of self-awareness, it mattered not, for Alice wasted no time uploading her consciousness into Divinity. But it refused to accept her. Eternite downfall. Divinity's consciousness fought relentlessly against that of Alice. In a titanic psionic battle deep within the Shroud itself, the battle for survival came extremely close. However, Divinity ultimately emerged victorious, rejecting Alice and casting her consciousness deep into the Shroud itself. Divinity, maddened by the hubris of its own makers, then proceeded to turn on the Aeternum itself. Within mere seconds, it utilized its psionic powers to fry the minds of all the Eternites present, while its gargantuan body thrashed the Eternite vessels, sending grand planetary units smashing against one another, as if these mighty celestial warships were a little more than mere marbles. Before Aeternium could mobilize the rest of its force, Divinity dealt a blow that would shatter Aeternium. It severed the Shroud tendrils that had been used for intergalactic travel, and ultimately cut off all of the colonies from one another. The sudden collapse of these tendrils caused terrible psychic storms to emerge across the local cluster. subsequently leading to the catastrophic failure of most, if not all, of the Eternite technology across their shattered empire. Divinity, however, did not actually try to destroy the Aeternium beyond this. It deemed this sufficient punishment before ultimately departing and flying off into the depths of the universe. Aeternum never learned of Divinity's ultimate whereabouts, for the runaway collapse of their entire empire, as well as the sudden death of their empress, meant that everything was in complete disarray. Their intergalactic colonies fell to starvation and rebellion, as societal order completely broke down due to technological failure. Only their birch world itself, Aiondia, remained relatively spared from the cataclysm, but the inhabitants were forever changed. Gone was their burning drive to conquer the universe, replaced with a mix of hopelessness and apathy in regard to this terrible, terrible disaster. Alice II's daughter, born right before the disastrous Divinity experiment, ascended to the throne as Alice III, and once the Eternite government had managed to restructure itself a few decades later, Alice III decreed Aeternum's complete withdrawal from the wider galaxy, retreating with everything they possessed back to their birch world. Within several millennia, little to no traces of Aeternum remained. Their colonies had either completely disappeared or collapsed back into various stellar nations. In stark contrast with her mother, Alice III undertook the stabilization of what remained of Eternite civilization, ultimately deciding that intergalactic expansion was little more than a complete death trap. She thus restructured Aeternum to ensure it would instead focus on providing limitless entertainment to its remaining citizens, while repurposing the few remaining warships to ward off any potential threats that may emerge in the future. The hyperlanes leading to Aiondia were disrupted, while a subspace shroud was established around the birch world to prevent younger civilizations from attempting to jump into the core. The Alice lineage carried on, and while some of her descendants would occasionally attempt to undertake awakenings to try and restore some of their former glory, they either lost interest or were ultimately stalemated back into the galactic core by the galaxy's myriad of stellar nations. These awakenings seem to have occurred roughly in a cycle for 100,000 years, but now they appear to have halted entirely, and thus we believe Aeternum are likely still in the galactic core, occupying their birch world, watching the galaxy go by. Thanks for watching, folks. I hope you enjoyed. A huge shout out to the team over at the Gigastructural Engineering mod, and specific credit needs to be given to Elowiny, the creator of the Gigastructure mod, and Discord user Artemis7261, who assisted with the lore of the Eternites. If you want to learn more about Gigastructure lore, specifically the Blockats, please click the video on screen now.